Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Stefan Livera Podcast, a show brought to you by Swan.com, the best place to buy Bitcoin with free buys on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin purchases. Joining me today is Jeff Yew. Now, I've known Jeff for years, actually, back from the Australian Bitcoin community, back when I was living in Australia. Now, as many of you know, I'm in Dubai, but it's great to chat with Jeff. Jeff is now the CEO and founder of Monochrome, who are basically setting up an Australian Bitcoin ETF. So, Jeff, first of all, welcome to the show.
Hey, Stefan. Nice to meet you and good to be back on the show.
Yeah, it's been a while, and I know lots has been going on, in Bitcoin all around the world, but I'm sure there's plenty of updates in terms of Bitcoin in Australia as well. So just give us a little bit of a background on what Monochrome is and where you guys are up to so far.
Yeah, so Monochrome's been it's been three and a half years in the making. I was previously running a digital currency exchange, so we've always been in the Bitcoin space. We started doing stuff like building out a Lightning network in my previous life in Brisbane. So we made the Brisbane airport accept Lightning payments in 2018, like a couple of months after LNDs actually went live. Then back then you have the Sync wallet and stuff, and then you got a wallet Satoshi, and then there was like long before. El Salvador had the Bitcoin Beach project. I think Australia's a hotspot. Sort of fast forward till today, Monochrome, we started off as an asset management business, sort of focusing on regulated access to Bitcoin, really to empower people to get into the asset class in a comfortable way. Bitcoin in the form of securities share. It's something very, very convenient and very familiar asset class to a lot of people. So for those that want to explore, so dipping their toes into Bitcoin, or those that want to diversify their ways of holding Bitcoin, an ETF is something that sort of like is quite popular. So we've launched the first ever ETF in Australia that holds Bitcoin. We're not the first Bitcoin related ETF in Australia, though I want to caveat that. But we're certainly the first ETF in Australia that holds Bitcoin directly in ETF. And that's the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF under the ticker IBTC. So far, so good. It's going well. We've seen some sell-offs in the US ETFs, but the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF has been stacking ever since launch. It's been net inflows day after day. It's good to see.
Yeah, great. And so can you give us the timeline then on the different Bitcoin ETFs in Australia, and when did IBTC go live?
Yeah, so the backstory really comes when ASIC, which is the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, it's kind of like the SEC and CFTC of Australia. They regulate securities, right, and financial products. They've came up with a framework to essentially let ETF issuers to be able to put Bitcoin in a retail fund. An ETF is a retail fund, and that requires a special license. And ASIC created a licensing category called crypto assets in late of 2021. And so throughout the process, Monochrome and our responsible entity, we went after the process, sat there, got the authorization in August of 2022, and approval for the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF scheme. We've launched an unlisted leg of the ETF in 2023. And then now in 2024, in the 4th of June, we've officially launched the ETF live on the stock exchange here, which is Cboe Australia.
Interesting. And so I'm curious, was there any, did the US Bitcoin ETF have anything to do with it? Or was it kind of like the Australian regulators and the Australian government were always viewing it independently in their own way?
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that people always people have the misconception that in Australia was really sort of waiting on the US, but it's actually not true, given that the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF as the product itself was actually greenlit in 2022, way ahead of any US Bitcoin ETF movements. But you did mention sort of the different types of ETFs. We've landed in a very awkward spot in Australia where there are 3 Bitcoin ETFs in the market, or 3 what I call one Bitcoin ETF and 2 Bitcoin related ETFs in Australia. They're all structured differently. And I think that's a problem that we want to talk about today, right? If you look at the US, all the Bitcoin ETFs are exactly the same. The ETF holds a Bitcoin is holding cold storage, and end of the story. And as a consumer, it's really easy to go and compare, these products. So which custodian do they use? What are the fee structures? And then you make a call. But in Australia, all the 3 Bitcoin ETFs are set up differently. The Monochrome Bitcoin ETF is like the US ones. It holds a Bitcoin in the ETF, which is what I think a spot Bitcoin ETF is. Although that the function that we have over the US one is that you can actually do in-kind subscriptions and redemptions. That's actually pretty powerful. We'll elaborate more later. The other 2 Bitcoin related ETFs are effectively feeder funds. One feeds into an unlisted wholesale only trust. So the retail fund holds shares in the wholesale trust. And then the other one is a retail offshore ETF. So the retail fund holds an offshore Bitcoin ETF in the US. So we've seen sort of a couple of innovation in the space, but really there's only one ETF right now in Australia. That's the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF that is licensed to directly hold Bitcoin on the ETF level. I think that's a really big step up from sort of the regulatory move into sort of crypto assets and Bitcoin products, and also the investor protection that was set up alongside it.
Gotcha. So can you elaborate a bit on the differences there? Because you were saying essentially one of these other ETFs holds shares in a trust, the other is an offshore ETF. What is the actual difference for the end user, the end customer who's deciding, okay, which of these 3 am I going to buy? What are the actual differences for them?
Yeah, so like if you categorize both, there are the indirect Bitcoin ETF and the direct Bitcoin ETFs. The Bitcoin ETFs that we're all familiar with, so with the US ones, is that they're all directly held. So the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF is directly held. To directly hold assets like Bitcoin in an ETF, there is a long list of checklists to go through with the regulator on how you deal with custody, how do you get a custodian to make sure that they meet the Australian custody requirements, RG133, the insurance requirement alongside a product, what kind of benchmark, what sort of certification does the benchmark provider for the price of Bitcoin needs to be, and also things as detailed as the experience of the asset manager on the issue of the product to deal with sort of these sort of asset classes. I think it kind of stems out from that ASIC views that crypto is a very different product compared to other sort of traditional, shares, commodities, and all kinds of equity products out there, because we know there is that non-recourseability of Bitcoin transactions, and also because it's a digital asset. There is inherently sort of different risks to sort of deal with it. So a proper framework is sort of have regulatory look through into the processes of these things being set up and how these things are run. It's like saying that if you're buying a car that comes with a seatbelt that is properly sort of regulated under the seatbelt law in Australia, versus someone on Facebook Marketplace just give you, yeah, this is a seatbelt, it works like a seatbelt, trust me, bro. It's gonna save you in case of emergency. Well, chances are it will. Maybe it's not going to do that. So it's very important for the investors to make sure that they understand the nuances of the products. Feeder funds are essentially not uncommon in the world of TradFi. In fact, it's very commonly used. But when it comes to where sort of Bitcoin ETFs are, it's like there's law and rules that says how a Bitcoin ETF should be run. Instead, there are players that sort of argue that regulatory position and say that, hey, if our ETF only holds shares, not Bitcoin, we don't need to go through the process to get certified to hold Bitcoin directly. So you're relying on the benevolence and how these structures are being set up, and you're accepting the risk by investing in these products because you're supposed to read the fine print. But we know that most retail investors don't look past the marketing. The problem is that all these ETFs, though they're all different structures, they're marketed exactly the same. Everyone calls himself Bitcoin ETF. Everyone calls himself spot. Well, it comes down to there's really no legal definition of what a spot Bitcoin ETF is in Australia. So it's a bit of a problem. You have sort of inherent regulatory risks in the product. If one day there's a step up of regulation to say that, hey, this loophole cannot continue. We need to close this. There would be potential implications to the unit holders in these funds that need to be structurally sort of dissected and rebuilt, potentially. And there's also hidden potential weaknesses in a product that out of good intentions, just because that they're not sort of structured properly in accordance to a framework that's specific tailored to crypto assets like Bitcoin. That's just different. So I think feeder funds are cheap products. When you buy a Mercedes car, the dealership would say that, hey, that's the cheap model and the expensive model. The expensive model gives you sort of like radar guidance, Apple CarPlay, blah blah blah, and the cheap model just get you the bare bones, right? And some people are happy to just go with a cheap one because it's like, I don't need all this stuff. But what we want to avoid is that people thinking they're buying that high end, sort of like the ones with the radar, cruise control, the one with the CarPlay, and realize in the end of the day they're not getting all these features. So I think the definition of what a Bitcoin ETF is really important, and the disclosures and being upfront about what these products are and what it achieves for the investors is also very important. And I'm a big advocate of cleaning up the clarity, the confusion of this scene over here, and I can relate to how this will look confusing from the outside perspective, given that it's a really Australia only problem. We don't have anywhere else that has Bitcoin ETF that has all Bitcoin ETF structured differently, and then it's up to the retail investor to go into the fine print and look for what these things are, and first and make a comparison.
So I'd say, so it looks like it kind of comes down to marketing. Like basically, you will need to market differently, and they are, as you said, they are all considered spot Bitcoin ETFs, even if, as you might want to characterize other ETFs in a different way. So I guess what I'm hearing from you, it sounds like one of the key differences is going to be that you can offer other certain things, and maybe there can be arguments made about the level of the custodian and the level of recourse in case something breaks down, something goes wrong. Maybe there's a clearer chain, clearer path to a resolution. Perhaps I'm not an expert, so I'm not claiming any expertise there, but if you had to spell it out in a clean way. So I guess it sounds like the main difference is that you are directly holding Bitcoin, right? Like that's kind of the end of the day. That's the main difference. You are directly holding Bitcoin. Competitors are indirectly holding Bitcoin. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right. And then the counterparty risk is really just on the ETF. Obviously, the ETF is very well, strongly regulated, tightly sort of controlled, set up and operated. So risk is something else that it's an interposed structure. You're exposing yourself to a bit more counterparties in the picture. If all goes well, that's fine. But I think it's just like, if you're dealing with something as delicate as Bitcoin and as long term of investment as Bitcoin, you want to make sure that you don't get that call in the middle of the night saying something's went wrong. We did something wrong. We're going to fix it, and this is going to cost you this, or it's going to affect you that. So it's about you don't have to sort of worry about looking to your back and what happens if the regulator closes a loophole, how it changes your holding, and potentially sort of tax implications as well from that.
Gotcha. Okay. And so just comparing so people can understand like an overview, what are the fees like for the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF?
Yeah, so the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF is actually, there's two parts of the ETF. It's a dual access product. So the on-market structure where people purchase through the stock exchange, it's 98 basis points, so 0.98%. And the off-market is it's negotiable for wholesale investors. So other fund managers that want to build products on top of IBTC, obviously they're going to get a different price than what people are paying on the stock market, stock exchange. So it is structurally a little bit more expensive, but I think people just need to understand what the differences are and how this benefits them. The in-kind subscription and redemption stuff that we'll elaborate more on. We'll talk about why these might sort of be. These have to be priced into consideration of comparing these prices.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, look, I think the first reaction most people are going to have is, whoa, 0.98%. That's quite a lot. If you think about if that's an annual fee, just under 1% per year, that's the amount you're paying. Now, I guess the argument could be, look, this is not intended for. It could be that this is for the people who are newer to Bitcoin. They need an easy pathway in. It could also be argued that maybe the in-kind redemption part, and we'll get to that, maybe that's also part of that. But I guess, in your view, put it this way, are Australian investors going to think, well, why pay 0.98% when I can go over buy a US Bitcoin ETF at 0.25 or something in that range?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So if they have the ability to do it, they are free to do so. The benefit of the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF, the distinction against the US ones, that you can actually withdraw the Bitcoin out without triggering a tax consequences, obviously subjected to your own tax advice. This is actually quite significant because you don't want to be ending up in a situation where, like the whole Airbnb and Uber model, right? It's like they slash their fees to compete in the market, drive out competition, and then once there's no competition, you're stuck in the product. And as long as, like, imagine this in a scenario where when it gets to a certain point and it's like, all right, we're going to start making money on these products. We can't just loss lead to operate these products, justify for customers. And then as long as say in 12 months time or 24 months time, Bitcoin's much higher. Everyone has an unrealized gain in the asset in the ETF holding. If the fees slowly creeps up, as long as it's the fees absorbing the increasing fees is less painful than cashing out and paying taxes on the gains and then buying the Bitcoin back at a different structure, you're stuck. Whereas in the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF, yes, you might, there is cost obviously involved to run the product. So 98 basis points, it's to us, that's sort of like where we sort of price it fairly. But in the end of the day, right, if you decided that your relationship with the Monochrome Bitcoin ETFs come to an end, you want to part ways, take the Bitcoin out, put somewhere else, cold storage, self-custody, it's up to you. That is the two-way, we keep this two-way street open versus something that is like locked in, because you never know when you're gonna need to take the Bitcoin out to self-custody or give yourself a more strategic positioning in the future so that you don't lock yourself in. Because in the end of the day, right, it's like most people don't invest life-changing sum of money into an ETF. If the big investors, they would come in through the off-market channel, get a rebate from us from a volume discount or whatever that is, and you're not actually making a big difference in the grand scheme of things when you're paying 20 basis points or 98 basis points for $8,000 investments in Bitcoin versus a potential more costly restructuring process in down the line where it really kicks you and you kind of like have bias regret, and that's not what we want for the investors in our fund structure.
Interesting. And so I understand that then, as you're saying, it's mainly a consequence around capital gains taxes, or that's one of the main reasons it might be worth your while. So I guess hypothetically, in some of the other Bitcoin ETF situations, you might need to actually pay a capital gain on the way out. So as an example, let's say the new coiner has decided, okay, I'm going to start with this Bitcoin ETF. Maybe for whatever reason, they can't buy it just normally on an exchange like everybody else. Like as in directly buying Bitcoin, they decide to go with an ETF. If they were to buy one of the ETFs that does not have in-kind redemption, then they're going to, like, depending on what country and so on, in Australia, it's going to get, I think it's over 1 year, you get a 50% discount, and then it's added to your assessable income. So it's basically at the, your marginal tax rate, whether that's 35% or 40% or whatever, that's how much you're going to be paying on the amount that you've gained. And so, if Bitcoin now is, call it 60,000, and who knows, in a few years' time, if it's multiples of that, that could be a pretty significant tax bill. So I guess that's the thing people have to really weigh up when it comes to that. So I guess this comes down to the in-kind subscription and redemption. I'm curious as well, is this parallel to, in the US, there were some of the ETF analysts talking about this idea of in-kind versus cash create. Is that a similar distinction there? And basically in the US, they weren't allowed to have in-kind. They had to have cash create and redemption, right?
Yeah. So cash create means that the ETFs, and this is more specifically to term in the US, it's more tailored to the market makers. So when authorized participants like market makers wants to create units to sort of fill the the books, they can only do it with cash. Whereas some market makers, they already sit on a stack of Bitcoin. They want to use their Bitcoin to quickly get in and out of position. It's a bit more frictionless. Some jurisdictions allow for it, and some jurisdictions like Bitcoin, like the US Bitcoin ETF, just don't allow for that. I don't know exactly the reason why they don't allow it, because it was kind of a last minute change, as we recall. But in the context of Australia, both authorized participants and the investor have the option to do cash and in-kind subscription and redemptions.
Gotcha. And so that means, hypothetically, you could put your Bitcoin into the ETF to be held by the fund and, I guess, custodied by, your custodian, or withdrawn out if they, on the way out. So I guess that's the main trade-off there, right? That's the main distinction. So I'm curious, why would people put Bitcoin in? I guess I'm thinking of like, not your keys, not your coins, get your hardware wallet and all that. But I'm curious, is it some kind of specific institutional setup? Like, why would people do that?
Yeah, I guess it's like, the way I look at Bitcoin is that Bitcoin's an asset class is really unique because it has the ability to do self-custody. Like, not many asset classes have that ability to do it. But in the end of the day, right now, people's circumstances are different. Everyone's life circumstances starts differently and changes as well. So having that diversified way of holding your Bitcoin is really up to the investors to decide. Something like an ETF, obviously, it's got its pros and cons. Like, you're holding the Bitcoin under a custodial structure, although it's regulated and everything. But same back to the not your keys, not your coin stuff. And at the end of the day, we've seen people that has very comfortably holding a lot of Bitcoin in self-custody, and then they go through a rough patch in their life, and they click on the wrong link, and there you go. See you later. So it's just a wave of people that realize now with the ETF, it's just another way for them to diversify their holdings, and potentially what we've seen in the market is that there are firms in Australia that are accepting and has accepted IBTC for eligible as security-backed borrowing, eligible assets for that. And that's another thing that people look at, is that, if I put into this as my Bitcoin in a security form, gets me more access to sort of more TradFi products like security-backed lending, borrowing, and using the securities to borrow against. It's arguably safer than borrowing by Bitcoin, because if I do a Bitcoin loan, Bitcoin actually leaves the cold storage, whereas in the sort of securities lending, the Bitcoin never leaves. So unless you sort of walk away from your loan and then the loan provider has to sort of sell down the Bitcoin. But at the end of the day, it's just up to the investor to decide what's really good for them. That's why we keep this sort of more flexible. It's a strategic sort of future-proofing provisions that we've intentionally created. And ultimately, right, it's like we're building a Bitcoin product. We're not building a TradFi product that has exposure to Bitcoin. A real Bitcoin product should allow people to take the Bitcoin out, because there's actually Bitcoin in it. So if you're buying into an ETF that only allows you to take out fiat, then you're just buying a fiat product that just happens to track the price of Bitcoin. It's not a real Bitcoin product. So I guess there's a bit of a Bitcoin nerd in me speaking there, but that's one of the things that one of the reasons, on top of what we mentioned earlier, what we decided to go with the structure.
Yeah, I see. So I guess in essence, for certain individuals, and again, I'm not recommending this, like for most individuals, yeah, not your keys, not your coins, hodl your coins, etc. But maybe at an institutional level, maybe at a very high net worth level, there may be some people who want to put in a portion, and for them, it might make sense to do a small portion of their overall stack that they want to, let's say they want to borrow against their coins. And maybe that could also be in a situation where they want to get cheaper cost of capital, right? Because maybe, as an example, I've seen maybe in the US case, I've seen organizations like Interactive Brokers, and they're international as well, but I know they were offering people to do stuff like borrow against your shares at 6 or 7%, something like this. Whereas if you compare that to, let's say you go to Aladdin or Unchained Capital or someone else to borrow against your Bitcoin, that cost might be higher. That might be more like 15%. So I guess that is a fair difference that people have to think about. are they willing to take that now? To be clear, are they willing to take that risk of, putting the coins in somebody else's custody? But for certain people, maybe that's worth their while. I'm not saying I recommend that, but I'm just trying to explain for the circumstance that is not just a kind of everyday hodler, but maybe there are other institutions that have their own institutional reasons for taking a different course of action. So I guess that's how I'm seeing that. Do you see that as, I guess right now it's early days, but I guess in the future, let's say volume grows, liquidity grows, at that point you might see more of a market and more, let's say, financial institutions who may offer this kind of collateralized loan product against a stock.
We've already started seeing that already. So we've seen terms being floated through our doorsteps of lenders that are offering terms for IBTC specifically. And this comes back to the way that like IBTC is structured. We are the only proper licensed Bitcoin ETF, meaning that the Bitcoins license to hold Bitcoin directly. If someone provides a loan, it's usually a long-term product. You don't want to be halfway through the loan term and something changes to the product, dramatically, that you have to then change the whole setup. Like it's gonna be catastrophic. And that's why, like, if we're working with if you're working with like sort of self-directed retail clients, they might just buy whatever cheaper on the face value because they've not considered a lot of stuff that might be relevant to them in the future, or just like they just wanted to take a 6 months bet on Bitcoin and never touch it again, right? But if you're talking about long-term product, whether you're a financial advisor that is offering this product into your platform, or building a business on top of IBTC, like another managed fund that sort of diversifies into a ETF holding that gets you exposure to Bitcoin, you want to make sure you don't have to be constantly looking at the back, so something might change fundamentally for the product that it will stop working for you. So yeah. And also I want to add that on the custody, self-custody side, it's like, look, we are all Bitcoiners, right? Or we're big advocates of self-custody, and that's like the biggest thing about Bitcoin, right? It's like you can do that. You can't do that with shares and everything else. Really, that's like the trusted third-party holds all over and all these kind of products. That's why we structure a product in a way that you can actually take Bitcoin out to self-custody when you decide you want to or you're ready to. So we've seen sort of like two types of buyers for the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF. Looking at the numbers that we've crunched, there are these sort of small little chunks that comes in. These are sort of like self-directed retail flows that comes from the brokers like ComSec, NapTrade, Superhero, Stake, and all these platforms, brokerages. But there also like the big chunks that comes from sort of more like interactive brokers, or Morgans, Schwann Partners, and these are big sort of firms. So we've seen like two kinds of investors, and we really sort of appreciate the flexibility of the structure, the concrete of the regulatory position of IBTC, and I think that gives people the assurance to sort of like work on this thing with a more long-term view, because Bitcoin is a long-term asset, right? We're going to be here for a long time. Bitcoin's going to be here forever. It's going to be here longer than we're going to be breathing on the planet.
Right. Yeah, we'll be here for longer than we are. And so, yeah, it's important to understand some of these different market aspects, how these things are playing together. So I guess in terms of who is this opening the market up to, right? Like there'll be random people who maybe they wouldn't have gone to an Australian Bitcoin exchange, but they do have a ComSec account maybe. And on that ComSec account, now they've just got this ticker that they can just, buy that. And so that, I guess, makes it a lot easier for people. And I guess the other point is that it makes it a lot easier for some of these big regulated funds and things like this. Now that there's kind of this instrument, it's now opening the door more for some of these different, because in Australia there's these massive superannuation funds. I guess it's opening the door for some of them to now also look and have an easier pathway to buying Bitcoin. Whereas historically, maybe it was they had to go to an exchange and sort of think about custody and think about all these other things. Now it's more like, oh, okay, here's this regulated instrument that you can buy. It's already existing inside the regulated environment.
Yeah, and one distinction about buying Bitcoin on an exchange from a pricing perspective, right? We all know the regulatory difference of a crypto exchange and an ETF. But from a pricing perspective, people often overlook that, all right, I'm paying management fees on an ETF. but the execution of the pricing is actually on a benchmark. It's actually a regulated certified benchmark provider that tells you what the fairest price of Bitcoin is. Whereas on an exchange, you're getting whatever price that shows up on your screen, right? So even if they say that you're getting 0% trading fees, but you might be getting less Bitcoin up front because the Bitcoin price has hidden spreads in it, whether it's by design or just by the nature of some of these platforms are operated. They're just operationally heavy because they're FX, the FX leg. A lot of people don't realize that even if you buy Bitcoin from a crypto exchange in Australia, order book exchange sites, and the liquidity, the problem becomes bigger with order book changes because the AED Bitcoin order books are really shallow. But in the end of the day, most crypto exchanges in Australia are brokerages. They're using your AED to go change it to USD and take the USD to buy, BTC or ETH or all this kind of types of crypto. So in the end of the day, there's these sort of hidden procedures that people don't really see. So if you're just looking at the face values, like I'm paying management fees, I'm getting like free here, but nothing's free in this world, right? And you might be getting less Bitcoin up front and be oblivious to it, and then versus something that is properly benchmarked. And that's sort of why using a regulated, that's one extra benefit of using a regulated product. You have the assurance that you're not going to get
so it comes down to how much you're getting for how much you're paying. And as you said, some exchanges kind of have they might have low fee, but actually you're paying kind of in the spread per se. And especially if you're doing larger orders, that's where that's where you can get like a slippage kind of factor happening in some of the especially in less liquid markets, where maybe you think you're going to get it at this price, but especially if you kind of make the mistake of doing a market order at a certain larger volume, now boom, you could have accidentally paid a lot higher for that Bitcoin. So that's certainly a fair point. People have to, consider the right way to execute. Now, of course, to be fair, there's also OTC desks, and some of those OTC desks also exist to try to give you that as well. Like, let's say you're doing a big order, then they can sort of give you, okay, we're going to give you, 100 Bitcoin at this particular price. And so now that's helping you deal with that. But people have to be aware of some of the different dynamics here. On the custodian point, can you explain a bit about the custody that Monochrome Bitcoin ETF is using? And can you say who it is?
Yeah, I mean, the custody provider it's public. We use Gemini custody. So Gemini's historically was working with the largest bank in Australia, Commonwealth Bank, to create a crypto brokerage app. That product sort of went into ice when sort of the Luna Terra stuff happened, and it sort of the whole long bear market happened. But that's where sort of why we selected Gemini, is because they were the most ready custodian that has experience wrapping their product into the Australian context. And that's something that the regulator really appreciates, is that even though you're a regulated custodian in the US, it doesn't mean that you're automatically a regular custodian under this new crypto ETP framework in Australia. You still have to do the you still have to do the time to get your stuff wrapped up, to show that, demonstrate that you have what it takes, all the structures, all the legal documents and proofs, and all the audit reports, and really just to set up a really focused instance just for Australia to really be a proper custodian for an ETF provider. So this is one thing, goes back to like the feeder funds. Feeder funds do not need to worry about this provision. It's really up to the stock exchange to go like, yeah, we're comfortable with Coinbase, we're comfortable with this guy, that guy. Whereas a framework-led custody approval process is a bit more robust.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the Coldcard Mark IV and the new Coldcard Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases, you can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. The lead sponsor of this show is swan.com, and Swan has a mission to onboard millions of people into Bitcoin. I also work at Swan, helping on some educational content for the team. Now, the team have also put out a new version of the Swan Bitcoin application, which is available on your smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android. Now, this app has a really fast onboarding experience. It's now just a few minutes to go from zero to Bitcoin. So if you are standing there with your family or friends and you might have been having trouble trying to get them onboarded, well, try this now. Recommend Swan Bitcoin. And you can do this while you're standing next to them. They can click through, and most of them will be able to set up and do this in just a few minutes. Also, the team at Swan have rolled out a new promotion. There are zero fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys. So this is a great way to go from zero to Bitcoin, and in a guided and managed way. So reminder, go to your App Store or Play Store and search Swan Bitcoin to get onboarded with Bitcoin today. This show also brought to you by mempool.space, the leading Bitcoin and blockchain visualizer. I use it all the time when I'm checking transaction fees and trying to understand what is the state of Bitcoin's mempool. You can search transactions, historical as well as unconfirmed ones, and also see a great way to visualize things across the Lightning Network, Liquid, mining, and so much more. Also, for those of you with an enterprise, they offer a mempool.space enterprise program. So for those of you as part of that enterprise program, you might want to get increased API limits, and you might want to have increased access to the team in terms of feature requests. You might want to have special branding in terms of how your custom instance of mempool.space looks. So to sign up for that, go to mempool.space/enterprise. And now, back to the show. Okay, so I guess the other question that people will probably have, especially the more Bitcoiner, the ideological Bitcoiners, many of whom are, people like myself and listeners, and probably yourself also, a lot of us, I guess, people are asking the question, are institutions good for Bitcoin, or could they somehow come to influence the protocol later down the track? Now, to be clear, I'm sure Monochrome is a much smaller fish compared to, let's say, the Black Rocks and the Fidelities of the world, holding, hundreds of thousands of coins. But I'm curious your thoughts there. Is there a risk that, let's say, a lot of coins end up inside institutions, and then do some of these institutions end up influencing the protocol, or what do you think there?
Yeah, I think throughout the block size wars, we've seen that no matter how much coins you have, or how much hash power you have, you really have no say in Bitcoin. Bitcoin has nodes. The centralization of the node network is really sort of there to relay the true version of Bitcoin, right? So I'm not too worried about that.
I mean, it's yes and no. Go on. I'll answer you after, but finish your answer.
Yeah. But I think there's also real risk of say if the entire space been taken over just by big TradFi players, because ultimately their decision making on what's good for Bitcoin will be very different from what we view as what's good for Bitcoin, because we live and breathe this space. We were here in the dark ages of the asset class. We've been here I've personally been here since 2013. We do this because we love this stuff, right? Whereas in a big fund, we go like, aha, this is profitable. Let's do something. But at the end of the day, they don't have the ethos of really why this is important. I think Bitcoin is the most important public utility project that that is in our lifetime to build. It's a once in a generation thing that we really have to protect. So if you have bad decision making on a leader at what people deem as a leader in the space, and that's going to have, it's not going to really change Bitcoin, but it might slow down useful progressions that Bitcoin needs in order to help people that not necessarily will be under the radar of this big corporate giant, right? And at the end of the day, right, for example, the fork policies on Bitcoin ETF. If you look into the fork policies in a lot of the US Bitcoin ETF, it does say something like, the issuer would decide who's the dominant chain to follow, right? Whereas in our perspectives, we made it very clear it's the one with the most proof of work, and this is something that only a Bitcoiner will pick up, right? And this is something that one of the small differences, but you can see that when you extrapolate out to many decisions in the future, this might be a risk. But in the end of the day, right, Stefan, like Bitcoin's for everybody. Like who's for us to say, us the pleb to say that who can or can't use Bitcoin, and that's the whole point of Bitcoin, right?
Yeah, and so I mean, lots of things to dig into here. I think, I mean, you're right. At the end of the day, there's this kind of Bitcoin is the money of enemies, right? And so there are times where I sort of see some Bitcoiners kind of going off against like random institutions, and at the same time, it's like, hang on, how do you propose to stop them buying Bitcoin or using Bitcoin? Like, if you really believe Bitcoin is the money of enemies, then yeah, like, if you. But I would also say I think there are risks, but I also think it's also fair to say there are benefits too, right? But we should talk about some of these different aspects of it, because one of them, as you said, yes, economic node, running your own Bitcoin node is part of how you determine what Bitcoin is. And of course, I run my Bitcoin node, and I know you run your Bitcoin node, but there's also a point that having a number of coins could potentially help under certain scenarios. So as an example, and I'm sure you were around, so I'm sure you know this, but at the time of SegWit2x, there was, as an example, there was a futures market on Bitfinex. So Bitfinex had this token B1X and B2X. So large holders were able to kind of put some coins on the platform and sell one and buy the other and so on. And that was able to, I guess, influence the market in a certain way to help people sort of see what they thought was the true Bitcoin. They didn't, because there was a lot of people who didn't want 2X. And that showed, right? I think from memory, it was something like 0.85 was the B1X token and 0.15 was the B2X token. That was kind of roughly, loosely speaking, what it was. So it's kind of like, yeah, the nodes matter, but also there is an element of market selection. There's an element of, large holders can try to, let's say, dump the fork that they don't like, as an example. So I'm curious, what do you think there?
Yeah, I think like, I don't see that in the long term you can stop Bitcoin in its tracks. You can slow it down for sure, but in the end of the day, I think that all this stuff that has happened, right, from Bitcoin XT, then you got Bitcoin Cash, all this experiments that has come and go about, we should change Bitcoin. In the end of the day, right, it only slows down the progression of where Bitcoin should be. But in the flip side, it also shows people don't bother. Don't try to do that shit again, right? And I think that if, say, for example, if Bitcoin Cash didn't happen, we will still be debating, or we will soon be debating, hey, why not we increase the block size in 2024, right? And the fact that it hasn't happened because, that has happened and people realize it's a failure. So I think that I always tell, my team is that everything has to happen, everything that will happen and has happened will have to happen for Bitcoin to succeed. So it really has to go through this process of like, yeah, whoever wants to attempt to take over Bitcoin or change it, let them be, right? You can't stop them, but they will fail eventually, right? It will cost them a lot of money. And eventually it will just show people that it just rules out another attack vector of Bitcoin. It makes Bitcoin stronger.
Yeah, I see. So yeah, as you said, there will be things tried. Some examples could be maybe the government says, oh, you need to do a whitelist or you need to do a blacklist of coins. You're not allowed to send to this place or that place. They may say things like, oh, we want to try to control the mining network. Now, of course, that will be difficult because there's mining all around the world, and there's mining pools all around the world. But there are different arguments about, Bitcoin mining, centralization, block templates, things like this. And so, there are instances where entities operating inside the regulated environment will obviously be a lot more subject to the whims of the government and the politicians of the day. And so, that is a downside. I think we have to acknowledge that. But also, to be fair, there is a benefit also that, there's safety in numbers, right? And I think getting more people to have an interest in Bitcoin is also a good thing. And I think it's fair. We have to sort of acknowledge both sides of the ledger there, because getting more people to hold Bitcoin means that there'll be less people who want to try to attack Bitcoin or make it illegal or regulate it out of existence, the more people who hold it. And so if there's institutions that allow people's pension funds or their superannuation money to go into Bitcoin, then it's kind of the safety in numbers point also applies. That makes it harder to actually ban Bitcoin or stop it.
Yeah, and actually, like, this comes back to like reason. I'm not share this with many people. The real reason why I notice that I needed to start is that because no one else is doing something like we do, right? A lot of Bitcoin native projects, they don't really venture out into the TradFi space. And even if they do, they're not really successful. They never really get anywhere because you really have to play a part to be accepted into that space, and we acknowledge that. And a lot of TradFi players, when they come into Bitcoin, they might not fully understand like the ethos of what Bitcoin is, and they might try to support a potential another big block conversation. They're like, that sounds like a good idea. Let's try it, right? Whereas we go like, we've tried this like 5 times, it didn't work, bro. Like, so I realized that it's very important to have someone that is Bitcoin native play their game in their court, instead of just letting all of them be TradFi players just rushing into the space because they think they can make a lot of money from charging fees and all this kind of stuff and controlling, who holds the most market share, etc. But, at the end of the day, right, it's like, do you want to risk Bitcoin just, a mass adoption or a important sort of upgrade or you can say ossification. I believe in ossification, but let's say there's important upgrade on quantum, right? Quantum resistance, and then you have no say in the sort of the Bitcoin natives because we're all too small, and it's all the big TradFi players making decisions on behalf of the network. Something that important. So that's a bit hypothetical, but it's something that I see that is it's a bit of a risk because in the end of the day, right, it's like we do this because we like Bitcoin, right? We do this because we like it, but the big traditional players, they do this because their boss gives them a KPI to launch a certain amount of Bitcoin and grow a certain amount of stuff and etc. Like we're different. Like we're not the same. Like we like this stuff and we'll protect it to our deathbed. Like we'll die on this hill.
Okay, so when it comes to the size of the market, can you elaborate a little bit the size? Because obviously Australia is a much smaller market. Let's be honest. But can you just elaborate a bit on that? The size difference between the Australian market versus, let's say, the US market or others out there.
Yeah, I think the US market is a bit more, obviously size wise a bit bigger, but I believe that including sort of cryptocurrency exchanges, the investing population or the per capita person that invests in Bitcoin is higher in Australia from memory. I'm not sure how that has changed in the introduction to ETF. Maybe that's equal or succeeded, but Australians do have a big influence on really a lot of important sort of Bitcoin movements on top of the appetite for crypto. You've seen that. So for example, I'm in Australia. You come from Australia, right? And Wallet of Satoshi's run out of Australia.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people that are really talented that really wants to make Bitcoin more accessible here in Australia. So at the end of the day, right, I think ETFs appeal to a different market. There's a lot of people that would not be comfortable dealing with crypto exchanges because they've seen all this stuff with the FTX happening and stuff. It's like, we're not going to touch that. Or a family office, like, we're not going to touch Bitcoin until it's in an ETF. So an ETF is the first step for them, right? Once they feel comfortable, they can continue to sit in the ETF and do whatever they want with the security. Or, if they decided that they want to do self-custody, take the Bitcoin out, right? And that's really what, in the end of the day, right, we're here for, is to make it flexible for people.
I see. And so just in terms of Bitcoin in Australia in general, like what's the scene like from your perspective? How has it grown?
There's two camps, right? There's the Bitcoin scene, which we've sort of grown, we're sort of a homegrown Bitcoin team here over here. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of cool Bitcoin projects that originates from Australia and still run from Australia. But there's also that sort of whole crypto investing base that are more retail driven on crypto exchanges. But ultimately, we all start somewhere, right? A lot of Bitcoiners used to be shitcoiners, but it doesn't go back the other way. So I believe it's important to give people access to these products really let them go and experiment. If it works for them, it works for them, right? Yeah, at the end of the day, right? It's like the same way of why we say Bitcoin isn't for everybody. If someone decides Bitcoin is not for them, we don't have to force people to go buy Bitcoin. It's their own choice. They can buy something else. But back to Australia, I think really there is a. If you look at the diversity of the Australian economy, it's one of the most lack of a better word, dumb, right? If you look at even Singapore, look at China, look at Korea, and a lot of the Asian countries, and even in the West, the economy is very diversified. You got manufacturing, electronics, exports, imports, construction, yada yada. In Australia, it's property and mining. Like if you look at the Harvard chart about diversification, it almost looks embarrassing. We're like basically just two colors, whereas most countries. Any countries you click, even an African country that is still in its development, developing nations, and I'm very bullish on Africa, by the way. Like I think sort of Asia and Africa is like the future for Bitcoin, but it's a different story. It's something that really affects a lot of the older generation's acceptance to new ideas and new investment opportunities, because historically it's like mining works well. I made my money from mining. I made my money from property, and there's a whole. We can have a whole podcast about how Australia politics is really protecting and making sure the housing market keeps going, and that really kills the incentive for people to want to take new risks to try new asset classes. So yes, the younger generations that feel that maybe the game's not really tipping their favor, they would try something new. But we've seen the resistance from a lot more sort of older generations that go like, I'm comfortable, this has worked for me for 30, 50 years. Do I really care about Bitcoin? Do I need to care? The answer is probably no. And then, I think over time, hopefully we can change that. Some of them do. If you go to some of the Bitcoin Bush Bash meetups here, you can see a diversified range of people from all walks of life, from different ages. That's good to see. But we still have this problem that a lot of people are too comfortable with the very circular investment landscape in Australia.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, but so the meme or the joke is that the Australian economy is all about houses and holes, brah. Like we just dig holes and dig resources and sell them, and it's all about housing and the housing property bubble that's going on. But that seems to be the obsession, the craze. So as you said, a lot of the money is held by probably the boomer generation, and a lot of them are holding their wealth per se in properties, and so that's extremely popular. But that said, there is also a decent, I guess, culture of stock market investing also. But I guess that's what's going to change over time, because a lot of the younger generation will sort of come up thinking, I think eventually they're going to get to a point where they decide, why do I need to buy the bags of the boomers and buy their property when I can buy Bitcoin, right? And then there'll be all these other sort of the smarter boomers and Gen X people who have some wealth. They'll be thinking, okay, I need to buy Bitcoin to preserve my wealth. And so I think that's how it's likely to shift over time. But we've got a long way to go. We're still very, very early in all of this. And so that's kind of how I'm seeing it anyway.
Yeah, I think we live at a very different time of when that worked for them, because interest rate environments are different, and more importantly, geopolitical tensions are different. Right, we're probably living a moment in modern history where geopolitical tension and conflicts are at its highest, or it's brewing to be its highest. And something like property, right, in the end of the day, right, it's worthless in the face of a war zone. People say that, yeah, I can touch properties, I can touch my gold bars again, I can feel and touch, but I can't touch Bitcoin, so Bitcoin has no value. But I argue is that in the end of the day, right, all these investments and assets that people view, there are they are only ascribed ownership by law. And law is as virtual as Bitcoin is, except law can change, whereas Bitcoin can't. So Bitcoin's beautiful because it's an asset class. It's international, trades 24/7, and the best thing is that it has no sovereign or political risk attached to it. So if you're talking about diversifying assets from properties to farmland to mining stocks and everything like that, you're still within that sort of asset classes that are attached, that has sort of a level of attached political risk, right? What if your government progressively becomes more left, right? What if doesn't happen in your generation, but maybe your kids' generation? How are you going to protect that, right? Bitcoin, we're comfortable. We know for a fact that nothing's going to be able to affect Bitcoin because it's apolitical, it's ungovernable, the asset class, and it's the most neutral asset in the world right now.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to take in, and a lot of new people are going to be coming in over the next few years. Okay, none of us has crystal ball, we don't know, but I think there'll be a lot of people who have to learn about Bitcoin just because of all the other things going on around the world and the need to be able to actually self-custody this asset. I do like that you have at least the option of in-kind redemption, so that's at least useful that people can kind of get started here, and then when they're ready, that's when they can redeem, and maybe that's going to be a pathway for new people to come in, and also a pathway for large pools of capital, whether that's superannuation and retirement accounts, or whether that is non-retirement, just investment funds and people learning to save. So I guess we'll leave it there. Listeners, check out Monochrome. So the website is monochrome.au. I'll put Jeff's links in the show notes. So guys, hope you enjoyed the show. And Jeff, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks, Stefan.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it out there with your family and friends. Check out my website at stefanlivera.com, and I will see you in the Citadels.